The reign of Edward the Confessor is often overlooked by the events that immediately followed his death in the first week of January 1066. What type of king was Edward the Confessor? Was he at fault for the turmoil of 1066? Here we'll attempt to answer these questions by journeying through Edward's near quarter century long reign. Edward was the son of Athelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. His father was a memorably hapless king who was hopelessly out of his depth, trying to fend off repeated Viking invasions. Edward's mother, Emma, was certainly cannier than Athelred. After Athelred's death in 1016, Emma married King Canute, and following on from Athelred's death in the spring, Canute fought a long and draining campaign against the old king's son, Edmund Ironside, Edward's half-brother. Edmund was decidedly more stoic than his father had been, as the tussle for the English crown rumbled on for 6 months until October of 1016. Thanks to the treachery of Edric Striona, Earl of Mercia, Canute triumphed over Edmund at the Battle of Ashenden, and a few weeks later Edmund was murdered, leaving Canute to establish himself as sole King of England. By marrying Canute, Emma had ensured her own political survival. But what of Emma's sons from her marriage to Athelred? Well, in 1013, Athelred had been forced off the throne by Svein Forkbeard, Canute's father. Athelred, along with Emma and their sons, Edward and Alfred, fled to Normandy, which is where the boys remained until the mid-1030s, until they made a fateful return to England in 1036, which would lead to Alfred being brutally killed and Edward just about escaping. During this period in exile, Edward would have met a young boy named William, who would be remembered by history as William the Conqueror. Later in life, William would refer to Edward as his relative. Throughout the early years of Canute's reign, one of the king's priorities was to eliminate potential rivals for the English crown. Another of Edward's half-brothers, Eadwig, was executed by Canute, and the sons of Edmund Ironside, Edward the Exile, and his younger brother, also called Edmund, no more than infants, were sent abroad, where they were to be murdered on the orders of Canute. However, the King of Sweden took pity on the young boys and refused to carry out Canute's demands. Edward the Exile and Edmund would end up at the court of the Hungarian king. It was clear that England during the reign of Canute was not a safe place to be for Edward the Confessor and Alfred. Their mother's marriage to Canute meant they were now the king's stepsons. But Edward and Alfred also happened to be the rightful kings of England, and Canute was little more than a usurper. At the time of Canute becoming sole king of England, Edward and Alfred were still young boys, and no match for the mighty Canute. And as time marched on, Canute's grip on power grew only stronger, and any hope of Edward or Alfred of reclaiming the English crown were purely fanciful. However, the political situation in England changed once again in 1035 with the death of King Canute, presenting a potential opportunity for rival claimants. The throne, it was agreed, would pass to Arthur Canute, Canute's son with Emma, whilst Canute's other son, Harold Harefoot, Arthur Canute's half-brother, would act as regent whilst Arthur Canute was busy in Denmark. However, Harold stole the crown for himself, much to Arthur Canute's anger. But Harold made little impression as king, and the most notable event of his reign occurred in 1036 with the arrival in England of the now mature Edward and Alfred. Were they trying to take advantage of the uncertainty and reclaim the crown that was rightfully theirs? It's possible. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that Edward and Alfred wanted to visit their mother at Winchester. However, they were prevented from doing so by Earl Godwin and his supporters. Godwin, now the most powerful man in England, had initially been angered by Harold's seizing the crown, but Godwin didn't want to make an enemy out of the man who was now King of England, and he put his feelings to one side. The arrival of Edward and Alfred posed a threat to not only Harold, but Godwin as well. Edward and Alfred's retinue was violently attacked by Godwin's men, with Alfred being killed and Edward being forced back into exile. Harold Harefoot died in 1040, and Harthacnut finally arrived in England to become king. He was accompanied by his mother Emma and Edward, his half-brother. Despite Edward's obvious status as a contender for the crown, there was no animosity between Edward and Harthacnut, and the two got on well. But Harthacnut's reign was a short-lived one, only 2 years. The Danish rule over England, that began in 1013, with an interruption of 2 years with the return of Athelred, was now at an end. England was once again ruled by an Englishman. Edward the Confessor was in his late 30s when he became king. His early life had been eventful and traumatic, as a number of his relatives had died violently. He had spent decades away from home, forced into exile by Svein Forkbeard and then Canute, with the threat of assassination potentially hanging over his head. But now was his moment of glory. Edward was, of course, a deeply pious man, and there would be times during his reign when he would need his faith. When he came to the throne in 1042, England was stricken by a variety of problems. Terrible weather had led to crops being destroyed, which resulted in famine. Disease spread across the country, killing cattle and farm animals. This was hardly the ideal way of starting a new reign, but the return of the crown into English hands was still a cause for celebration. Edward was crowned at Winchester Cathedral on the 3rd of April 1043 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Eadsigh. In one of his first acts as king, Edward rather dramatically stripped his mother Emma of her lands and money. He also stripped a man named Stigand, who was also close to Emma, of his bishopric. Evidently, Emma was being accused of treason by men surrounding the king, including Earl Godwin, hence Edward's actions. He would later restore Emma's lost goods to her. But Godwin clearly wielded an undue amount of influence over Edward, and this only increased over time, especially when the king married Godwin's daughter Edith. A few years later, in 1049, Edward was contacted by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. Henry wanted support against the rebellious count, and support was not in short supply across Europe. Even the Pope became embroiled in the matter. Edward, for his part, assembled a fleet off the Kent coast, where he waited, lest the rebellious count should try and escape the Emperor's clutches by sailing across the English Channel. This fairly dramatic event aside, Edward's main concern continued to be not only Earl Godwin, but also Godwin's sons and other family members. The king was approached by one of Godwin's sons, Svein, who wanted to be restored to some lands that had been taken from him. Svein had been on campaign in Wales when, on his return to England, he had scandalously abducted the Abbess of Leominster. Svein's pleas, unsurprisingly, met a cold reception at the king's court, and even his own brother, Harold, urged Edward to reject Svein's pleas out of hand. Another man who stood in opposition to Svein was Earl Beorn, a distant relative. Svein later murdered Beorn when the two were riding to meet the king. Svein disposed of the body, but Harold, on hearing of the dreadful deed committed by his brother, rode out, found Beorn's body, and had him interred at Winchester Cathedral. Svein's actions had disgusted even his own supporters, most of whom abandoned him. The king declared Svein to be a man without honour, and sent him into exile in Bruges. However, that exile didn't last very long, and Svein returned to England in 1050, and he was declared to be no longer an outlaw. But as powerful and influential as Godwin and his family may be, Edward knew that they would be a continuing problem. Soon, existing tensions between the Godwins and Edward came to boiling point. In 1051, a violent dispute broke out between the local people of Dover and the Count of Boulogne, who happened to be visiting. For diplomatic reasons, Edward probably felt obliged to side with the Count and ordered Earl Godwin to march to Dover to teach the locals there a harsh lesson. The Earl, however, refused to comply with the King's orders, asserting that he would not harm his fellow countrymen. A council was called in London to discuss the matter further, and things became increasingly heated. Godwin wanted hostages as assurance for his safety at the meeting, whilst the king demanded homage was paid to him. The meeting ended with Godwin and Sweyn crossing the Channel into exile, whilst Harold sailed for Ireland. They would be back, and Edward knew this better than anybody. Disgusted by these events, Edward turned his back on Edith and committed her to a convent and seized most of her money. This seems wholly unfair, as the dispute was hardly Edith's fault. Godwin and his sons returned to England in 1052, sacking, seizing ships, and taking hostages as they went. Ultimately, Edward's hand was forced. The Godwins were too powerful for him, and he restored Earl Godwin to his earldom, and Edith returned to the king's favour. The following April, 1053, Earl Godwin, while sitting alongside the king at a feast, and in front of two of his sons, Harold and Tostig, became seriously ill. The description of his symptoms would indicate a stroke, and after a few days clinging on to life, he died at Winchester. Harold would succeed him as Earl of Wessex. For Edward, the death of the overbearing presence of Earl Godwin would hardly have been a disappointment, but the king also knew that the Earl's sons were no shrinking violets either. During these troubled days, Edward welcomed to his court the young Duke of Normandy. Duke William, aged now about 23 or 24, brought with him, in the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a whole troop of Frenchmen. Edward received him warmly. Is it possible that, during this visit, Duke William was made Edward's heir? Edward, by this point, was in his mid-40s, and still without a son. The good news was that his wife, Edith, was still a young woman in her mid or late 20s, so it was still possible for Edward and Edith to produce children. But nearly 9 years of Edward's reign had passed, and no heir had been produced by the royal couple. Was Edward abstaining from this most vital of royal duties because of his strong religious convictions? That remains the most compelling argument, although many modern historians have come to be sceptical of this view. Perhaps Edward had a medical issue, but this, now nearly 1,000 years later, can hardly be proven. Is it possible Edward saw in the strong young Duke a possible candidate for the throne, and given his troubles with the Godwins at the time, he may have wished to ensure that the crown didn't fall into their hands? But in 1057, with still no sign of an heir, another potential successor to Edward's crown arrived in England. This was Edward the Exile, the man who had been sent overseas by Canute to be murdered as an infant. On hearing of Edward's survival, King Edward, the exile's uncle, recalled him to England. As time had gone by, the king must have given more and more thought to the succession, and here, in the shape of the son of the formidable Edmund Ironside, was an almost perfect candidate. Described by the Anglo-Saxon chronicles as a good man, Edward the Exile represented an opportunity to avoid a contested succession. Sadly, not long after landing in England, Edward the Exile died. But this didn't necessarily mean all hope was lost. Edward the Exile had a young son named Edgar, but Edgar was aged only 5 at the time of his father's death, and child rulers in Anglo-Saxon England, and later in history as well, were hardly a good idea. If King Edward should die soon, then Edgar stood little chance of becoming king. As it was, he was about 13 when Edward the Confessor died, and he was still too young to compete with the much more experienced Harold Godwinson or Duke William. Had Edgar been just a few years older at the time of Edward the Confessor's death, history could have been very different indeed. Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066 and was buried at his finest work, Westminster Abbey, which would later be transformed by King Henry III, who idolised Edward. This brings us back to the questions that I asked at the start. Firstly, what type of king was Edward the Confessor? It is notable that despite his issues with Earl Godwin and his sons over the course of Edward's 24-year-long reign, England was a relatively calm and peaceful place, especially when stood in contrast with what was to come over the next decade or so after Edward's death. Edward was, at the very least, a competent king. His handling of the Earl Godwin situation may on the surface look a trifle weak at times, but Godwin was a particularly difficult customer to deal with. Godwin's son Harold would serve Edward well, helping to deal with long-term and ongoing instability in Wales. In the northeast, Harold's brother, Earl Tostig, was driven out of Northumbria, with the Northerners demanding that a man named Morcar was made Earl in his stead. Edward granted this, but despite this, a collection of Northumbrians who had journeyed south sacked Northampton. This is further evidence that most of Edward's problems had centred around the Godwins. Secondly, and finally, was Edward at fault for the turmoil that followed his reign? The answer is partially, at least. Whether it was through choice or for some other reason, Edward, not having a son to succeed him, doomed Anglo Saxon England. It also has to be emphasised that he had plenty of time to think about the succession. Even if Edward had intended on getting Queen Edith pregnant, the time would have come when he realised that this was becoming increasingly unlikely. Edward should have outlined his wishes for the succession long before his death in a more defined way. Was his successor to be Harold Godwinson, his brother-in-law, Duke William of Normandy, the man whom he had welcomed to England, and who he may have felt a strong connection with, given his days spent in Normandy? Or Edgar Atheling, a young boy with the strongest ties to the English crown? There was another candidate also, Harold III Hardrada of Norway, who also held a claim to the English crown, albeit a flimsy one. Long before he died, Edward had plenty of options to choose from, and yet he chose to leave the succession shrouded in mystery. This was his biggest failing as king.